Welcome to part 2 of the presentation on swaps. In part 1 we talked about plain vanilla interest rate swaps. We talked about the general characteristics of swaps. We also showed that a swap can be thought of as a series of forward rate agreements. Now in part 2 we'll talk about currency swaps, equity swaps, and we'll also talk about how a swap agreement can be terminated. Again, recall the common theme is that a swap is an agreement between two parties to exchange a series of cash flows. When we talk about currency swaps, now the cash flows are being exchanged in different currencies. So let's look at a very simple currency swap where we have two parties. Party A pays Party B $1 million as a 3-year loan, and Party B pays Party A rupees 90 million as a 3-year loan. So now when we talk about currency swaps, the actual money is exchanged at initiation. So let's see what's happening here. So this is Party A and this is Party B. So at time 0, when the swap is initiated, what is happening? Party A pays B 1 million. So this is our initial. So $1 million goes from A to B, and Party B pays A 90 million. So this is the initial principal amount that is flowing between the two parties. So this is 90 million going from Party B to Party A. Then, assuming this is a 3-year annual pay loan, then what's going to happen at the end of every year? So at the end of year 1 as well as the end of year 2 and end of year 3, interest payments will be exchanged. So this middle box represents interest payments. Now since Party B has borrowed dollars, Party B is going to make interest payments in dollars. So Party B on an annual basis will make interest payments based on the agreed upon amount. So if Party B agreed to pay at a 5% rate, then 5% of $1 million. So this is how many dollars Party B will make this is the payment, interest payment from B to A at the end of every year. A, however, had borrowed rupees, so A will make interest payments in rupees. So that payment, given that the rupees have been borrowed at 12%, the rupee payment will be equal to 12% of 90 million rupees. So this is the payment that is made by A at the end of every year. And again, I want to emphasize that here netting does not typically take place. Here the actual payments are being made. And then after 3 years, once this currency swap is over, then we swap back the notional principal. So initially A had lent 1 million to B, so B now returns the $1 million, and Party A returns the 90 million. So this was a million, so returns the 90 million rupees. So that's a very simplistic currency swap. In this swap, we assumed a fixed rate for both currencies. Now, before I talk about the other types of currency swaps, let me very briefly discuss the motivation for a swap. Now, let's look at a very simple case. Let's say that Party A and Party B are two companies. So let's, for simplicity, say that we have one company that's called PACCO, which is a Pakistani company, and we have a US company called USCO. And it turns out that the Pakistani company is well known in Pakistan, and therefore its cost of borrowing in rupees, so the rupee cost is low, but the Pakistani company wants to expand in the US, so it needs dollars. Similarly, we have a US company that wants to invest in Pakistan. So for the US company, however, the dollar cost, so the cost of borrowing dollars for the US company is low, but what they need is rupees. Now, both of these entities can contract a swap facilitator who can bring these two entities together. And what can happen is, since the Pakistani company can borrow the 90 million rupees at a low cost, Pakistani company can borrow 90 million rupees at a relatively low interest cost and lend the 90 million to the US company. And then the US company, which is doing its operation in Pakistan, can then make interest payments based on rupees. For the US company, since it can borrow dollars at a low cost, so the US company gets its dollars at a relatively low cost, lends the dollars to the Pakistani company, and then the Pakistani company makes interest payments against the dollar. So by getting into the swap contract, both the Pakistani company and the US company have managed to reduce their cost of borrowing. So that is a simplistic example at level 1. That's all you need to really understand in terms of the major motivation for a currency swap. In the context of currency swaps, you need to understand that we can have 4 possible types of currency swaps. The type that we just saw is the simplest type, where party A pays a fixed rate on the PKR received, whereas party B pays a fixed rate on the dollars received. Okay, I apologize for this typo. Now type 2 is where A pays a floating rate on PKR received. So for example, party A might pay based on the Karachi interbank offer rate, whereas party B pays a fixed rate. So that fixed rate might, for example, be 5%. The third scenario is A pays a fixed rate on the PKR received. So A might pay a fixed rate of 13% and B pays a floating rate based on, say, LIBOR. And finally, we can have a situation where both parties pay a floating rate. So A can pay a floating rate based on CIBOR and B can pay a floating rate based on LIBOR. The third and final kind of swap we'll talk about is an equity swap, and within equity swap we can have 3 subcategories. One kind of an equity swap is where party A pays a return on an index and party B pays a fixed rate. And how does this work? Let's say that our index is the S&P 500, and let's say that we have a 3-year annual pay swap 0, 1, 2, 3. The way this equity swap will work is, for every year we figure out how much the equity index changed by. So if in this case we are saying A pays based on the return of S&P 500, B pays a fixed rate. Let's say that fixed rate is 5%. So if B is paying a fixed rate of 5%, then for period 1 we know that B is going to pay 5%, and let's say that over this period 1 the index went up by 10%. So this means that the equity index pair is going to pay 10%. The net effect is that the equity index pair is going to pay 5%. Then in the next year, let's say that the index went up by 15%. So if the index went up by 15%, again party B, the fixed pair is responsible for paying 5%. The equity index pair is responsible for paying 15%. So overall the equity index pair pays 15%. Now in the third year, let's say that the index goes down by 20%. Now party B, who's the fixed rate pair, pays 5%, and the index pair actually pays minus 20%. What this minus 20% means is that the index pair is not going to pay 20%, he will receive 20%. So effectively what happens is party B, which is the fixed rate pair, doesn't pay 5%, he actually has to pay 25%. So notice 2 things over here, that we figure out who pays whom how much at the end of every period. Unlike plain interest rate swaps, where we knew the payment on settlement date right when the period began, here we figure out who pays whom how much based on how the index did over the year. So the payment, which is 5% of the notional principal, can only be calculated at the end of period 1. And secondly, the payment even of the fixed rate payer can be variable. Notice that the payment over here, when the index went down, the payment for the fixed rate payer, which is B, is actually 25%. So when the index goes down, the fixed rate payer has to make a extra payment. So we say that in an equity contract, the fixed rate payer might also have to make a variable payment. Now, what are the two other types of equity swaps? We can have party A pays a return on the index, that again can be, say, S&P 500, and party B pays a floating rate. So rather than paying this 5%, let's say party B pays LIBOR plus 2%. So that's another example. Now here again, LIBOR will be determined at the beginning of every period, but the return on the S&P 500 will be based on the return for the overall period. So here again, we will not know what the payment is until the end of the period. And finally, we can have a setup where A pays based on one index, say the S&P 500, and you can have B which pays based on another index. So you might have party B which is paying based on the Dow Jones Industrial Average or Dow Jones Index. So two separate indices. Party A pays based on the return on this index. Party B pays based on the return on another index. Just to highlight 2 points, because these can easily show up on your exam. I've already talked about this, but payments on both sides can be floating, and I showed this in my example earlier where the equity index actually went down. So clearly the entity called the fixed rate payer still has a floating rate payment. Secondly, the payment is not known till the end of the settlement period. I think I've mentioned that enough times. Finally, how do we terminate a swap? So one way of terminating a swap is through where both, let's say, party A and party B are in this swap, and they both agree before the completion of the swap tenure that one party pays a certain amount of cash to the other party. If both parties agree, they can cancel or terminate the swap before the formal termination date. Another is that a party gets into an offsetting contract. So if a party has a pay fixed position, they can take opposite position by getting into a pay floating. So there might be a certain cost involved there, but by getting into an offsetting contract, we can also terminate a swap contract. Number 3, there can be a resale, but this is very unusual because we don't really have a secondary market for swaps. As discussed earlier, these are not traded on an exchange, so it might be very hard to find a third party that is willing to buy the particular swap contract that you have negotiated earlier. So this is extremely infrequent. And finally, you could use a swaption. Now this is fun to say, but I don't think we need to get into too much detail on this in level 1. All you need to know is what is mentioned on these 2 lines. A swaption is an option to enter into a swap, and what you might do when you've entered into a swap is also purchase a swaption for an offsetting swap. So if it turns out that you want to get out of your swap, then you can exercise the swaption. If you didn't quite get that, don't worry about it. We will see this in detail in level 2. Right now, just memorize these 2 statements. I'd say that as long as you just know that one way of getting out of a swap is to use a swaption, that is good enough for now. So that is it. As always, practice very hard. There are about 12 questions in the curriculum. Try to go through all of those 12 questions. They are excellent practice. And if you have any comments, please post them on YouTube. If you like this video, then please click on the like button.